Okay, so I am supposedly live now, and welcome back to Karim Talks About Economics. And this is the seventh podcast. This is really an extra podcast that I have created because I discovered, and also by notes from other people, I discovered that number six was a little bit, well, first of all, it was very laggy, right? There was no video, it was just pictures of me doing different things. And I actually didn't discover that while doing the podcast itself because it told me that I had excellent connection for the most part. Um, um, and additionally, this is also, and additionally, I also discovered that a large part of the beginning, and not a large part, but at least a small part at the beginning, my introduction to Omar, um, what was cut off, and the end was totally brutally excluded. I had talked about a lot of things that were quite important and quite interesting in my opinion, right? So what I'm going to do now, firstly, as I said, this should be seen as a continuation and an extra podcast um, to number six. But I'm going to have a small introduction and then just add the end of podcast number six, and then we're gonna end it there, and then we're gonna have another podcast this evening as per usual, right? So just for your knowledge, this is Karim Talks About Economics. It's a podcast that is characterized by being spontaneous, informative, and open-minded. It's spontaneous in that I do not plan a lot. Firstly, for this podcast, and also because I ask questions along the way that I might not have thought fully through, which allows us to reach well, it allows us to navigate through different valleys, different thoughts, which allows us new conclusions or new things that we had previously not thought of. And therefore, it's informative because it connects some dots that we had not previously connected. It's open-minded in the sense that it is not driven by a specific agenda, not a political one or an economic one or anything for that matter. It is here to ask things that we would not usually ask, and it was nice to have a different perspective because that opens our mind even more and expand uh, our knowledge uh, in a certain way. So the last thing that we talked about, or that I could see from podcast six that was published, was Omar talking about, or me explaining that Omar had talked about. Yeah, and before that, maybe it's worth noting that Omar is, I think, 16 years old. Um, we interviewed him, or I interviewed him, because he's a part of the Generation Z, the newest generation that we have living on this earth, and it's very useful to get their point of view as to include them in the world. And of course, I'm also young, but he's even younger, and their generation seems to stand out, right? By having, as he called it, a moral standpoint rather than an economic standpoint, because they feel that their basic needs have already been met, right? And that was the idea of the utility function, um, that was made up of materialistic and non-materialistic items. The materialistic have already been fulfilled, and it's very difficult to fulfill it even more. Um, and therefore the vast majority, at least as it seems, at least the loud minority, maybe, who knows how we're going to call it, maybe it's also the loud majority, but they are very voiced about the moral standpoints, as we discussed with Omar, the Greta Thunberg. That Greta Thunberg, for instance, is a great example of this, where she stands out for the climate, which is something that, yes, we have stood for it previously, but it has never filled as much in the political agenda as it has today, or even in the everyday life. It's it's something that's quite difficult not to talk about in the modern world. Also, the equality between different races is human races is something that is very close to their hearts, as we see in the United States currently. There's demonstrations in nearly every state that want equality, or at least a sense of equality between people, that everyone is equal in the eyes of the law and in the eye and should be treated equally, which is quite fair. We also had this discussion in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and we also had it in the 80s, 90s. But it seems as it is a recurring theme, and this generation is taking it even further, um, right? Posting about it constantly and things like that. It's filling more and more of the everyday life for them. Maybe that's because we have the coronavirus at the moment, and everyone is stuck at home, and they don't have an everyday life, and now they have time to think about these things. But who really knows, right? Okay. So we had talked about, is it the state versus the people? Are they working against each other? And the last thing that I remember talking about was in podcast number 6, was that maybe if I had asked a different individual, he would have said, well, we need the economics to be valued more uh, than the matters, let's call them matters of the heart, right? We also, with Omar, and I think that was the things that was cut out, we then moved into the behavior of 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 individuals, right? He said that people are nowadays less sociable. They are not sharing as much, and that's because they want a sense of perfection. They love entertainment, but they want it fast. They have a short attention span. He said. Um, However, he also said that we should just change now, right? Uh, which, as we dug more and more deep into it with him, we discovered that maybe it's because they want things fast, right? Which relates to their behavior again. How they want things to be perfect, but they also want them to be fast. However, we know, right, that things happen gradually. It's not that everything can be done here and now, which they of course want. They have every right to say so. However, um, their reality is not such, right? And then we talked about um, innovation versus boycott. At the beginning, he said that he would love innovation, and that is, of course, the correct way of going about it, to create new technologies. However, as we dug more and more deep to it, he even came up with the example. Well, we came up with the example of, say, together, but he was the one who argued most for it. The example of McDonald's versus the Canadian. Um, well, the Canadian Starbucks. I really don't remember James. Yeah, James Hortons, James Hortons or something like that. Right. I'm just gonna call it Hortons because I know that's the last name. And the argument was that if he knew that one of them was more environmentally friendly than the other, he would make business with that one. He would buy his goods from that one. Right. And yes, that is the freedom of choice, which makes perfect sense, as he said that you have the option to go over here and here. However, I saw it and interpreted it as a boycott, because it's a personal boycott for him. right? You don't have to abolish it completely by law, but because you vote with your feet, you're going to make one more profitable than the other. Correct? Well, yes. Is that sustainable? The question is it sustainable in the long run? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the other one will make an offer that is so much cheap that people would go to it. Or maybe the quality would be higher for the one that is less environmentally friendly and people would still buy that. No, nobody knows, but let's take his viewpoints, right? And in that means that we'll suddenly, or at least the new generation is willing to pay a premium, right? So everything equal, they're willing to pay a premium because as long as you're not indifferent, then and you're going towards one just because everything equal, just because one is more environmentally friendly, that means that you're valuing this more, which means that you're willing, in other words, right, in economics terms, and how that is for you guys, how we think about it as economists, you're willing to pay a premium. So we can put a kind of value to that it is environmentally friendly, right? And we can thus increase the price of that good such that the price up here is more such that you become indifferent between the two at some point. Now that is of course if you're ever willing to make a trade-off between the environment and the cost of things, but you are, because you have to sustain yourself and stay alive, right? So that's how it works. um yeah. One of the last things that we discussed, right, was the idea that he said, well, the technology exists, and I know that because I've also worked for Periscope, to, for instance, extract thermal energy, right, from the depth of the oceans. It is feasible. It's even been tested and it has been successful. However, it's not very profitable, right? Because it's not large scaled, and therefore you have to make many small machines. And let's look away from the fact that that may be less environmentally friendly, right? Even though you're not taking up oil out of the ground, it might be more environmentally destroying to create all of these small robots underneath the ocean and then destroy the animals that live on that ground. Right? Let's look away from that, but and only look at the economics behind it. He said that if we demand more from that source, then suddenly the price will go down, right? And yesterday we came up with the question that was, of course, not included in the podcast number 6, but let me read it out for you, and maybe today in this podcast I will talk about that. I will answer this question. So, what drives cheap prices? Is it cheap production or high demand? Right? Because the thing that he said is quite, for us economists at least, counterintuitive. He said that we'll demand more, and therefore the price would go down. However, the question is how he understood it correctly, and I tried to hint to that in the idea of yes, of course it's a circle that leads to that and that leads to that. However, where does it really start? Is it because we demand more that the prices are low, or is it because the prices are low that we demand more? Now, he said we'll demand more of this green energy and therefore the price will go down. However, that's not the case because, well, economically it's at least not the case, because we know that high demand, well, that allows the supplier of this thing to increase the price. And firstly, he might not be able to sustain all the demand. That's the first thing. And secondly, he will be willing to raise up the price as he knows demand is quite high and therefore earn a higher profit. Right? So that's why Omar's argument about just let's just demand um, is not very sustainable, and it's not strong. It's not an argument that holds ground, sadly, right? And that's also what Greta Thunberg is saying. Let's have change now. Let's move into greener production of energy now. That is not sustainable. It's not feasible because that would mean that you have to force, for instance, a company like Vestas or Ørsted to produce a large amount. Let's just say that windmills are the only green energy production thing that you can create right now. So they would have to produce a lot. But if they know that they will be asked to produce a lot, they would just say, well, okay, who's the highest bidder, right? I will produce for the highest bidder. I cannot produce for all of you, firstly, right? Cannot produce for all of you. So who's the highest bidder, first of all? And secondly, if it can produce for all, it would just say, well, you really want this. Let me increase the prices. Now, the counter argument would then be, well, we're the government, we're the people, we can tell them just to produce this even cheaper, right? And then what does that mean? Well, then you're forcing the suppliers to produce something at a lower cost. Firstly, I think the question becomes, well, how much profit are you then allowing them? Are you allowing them even a profit? Or are they just going to produce it at cost? Because that lowers their competitive power, and suddenly you have a control over these companies. And then the question is, well, are you then still living in a free world? And the argument is that if you have to force them, who's going to force them? If it is the government, then you want the government to have even more power. But the argument of Omar was, you have the state and you have the people, and he's the people, and he thinks that the state is not taking care of him, and he wants to give less power to the state and give more power to the people. However, now you suddenly want the state to intervene, right, in order to have more power to the people, or have the people's will. So, as you see here, it's a little bit of a tedious argument to argue that we can just demand things without them being sustainable or feasible or economically profitable. And that's what I want to convey to all the young people, all the Omars out there, all the Greta Thunbergs out there. It doesn't make sense to just demand things without innovation and profitability. It's not sustainable. That's not how the world works. And we've tried communism, where we just demand things to exist, and that will lead to lies, a lot of lies, because we're going to lie to make things to look good. And it does not allow the free market powers to exist. And if they do not exist, right, or they are mismatched, so demand and supply is mismatched, it's not sustainable for the long run. Now, of course, your argument, Omar's and Greta Thunberg's and the world, would be, well, the world that we live in at the moment is not sustainable. True. But hopefully we will find a way through innovation. I doubt that it will be through boycotts, because, as I said, if you demand things that are green, those green things will just cost more. And if they cost more, well, less people will demand them. That's just how it works. Unless you, of course, have a lot of money. But the argument, but then you will create a larger difference between the poor and the rich, right? Where suddenly the rich are not only rich, but they are also better better in their moral standpoints, right? And then you're gonna look down on the poor, not only because they are poor, but also because they have no moral standpoints, right? So I think that young people should really take care of how they argument for things and how uh, they think about things, and 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 think about the long run rather than only the short run and the midterm, right? The middle run. That is quite important, right? And with respect to the question, what drives cheap prices? Is it cheap production or high demand? It's cheap production, because it's argued high demand would just mean high prices, because the firm would be willing to just decrease demand for a little bit and then increase the prices without going into a long discussion about the elasticity of the demand, of course, because that also plays a role. But let's not consider that and keep it very simple. The motivation that was cut off from episode number 6 is also the motivation that I will tell you now, and that was to just keep swimming, as Dory in Finding Nemo says. Just keep swimming, just keep swimming, just keep swimming. And that relates to the idea that you might not um, have motivation today, you might not have the passion and the energy to work hard today, but if you've already planned it, just keep swimming, because you will have those days where you just don't want to work for it, but you have to, because you have a plan, hopefully. And that's the idea, right? Also from last time, uh, plan ahead and know that there will be some days where you don't feel like working, but those are the days where you just have to keep on swimming, because you don't want to regret not swimming that day, right? The idea, the example that I gave last time was also that you swam, you swam, you swam. If you stop swimming, you'd either sink or fall, but at least if you keep swimming, you will be in the same pace, you will not fall. And for the fish, it's bad to float up. So just keep swimming if it feels difficult. Don't give up. Just keep swimming. For now, I'll end the stream. I know it's much on this podcast. It's a little bit shorter than previous, and that was because this was um, an extension, or at least the parts that were cut off from podcast number 6. And I hope this podcast was good. It's worth noting that this is done with OBS, the software. It worked well for episode number 5. However, episode number 6 was not that good. And it will be interesting to see how this one turns out. And if it turns out good, I'll continue using it. However, if it doesn't, I'll go back to just streaming with the webcam. However, it's quite interesting to use this, because then I can share my screen with you guys. But for now, take care and see you later today.